This is volume 11 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, Psychology and Religion, West and East. The Ball Engine Series XX from Princeton. This is Jung's book, A Psychological Approach to the Dogma of the Trinity, published in 1942 and 1948. We are on chapter 2 of this book, chapter 1 of this book, subsection 3, which is called Greece. In enumerating the pre-Christian sources of the Trinity concept, we should not omit the mathematical speculations of the Greek philosophers. Cheers. As we know, the philosophizing temper of the Greek mind is discernible even in St. John's Gospel, a work that is very obviously of Gnostic inspiration. Later, at the time of the Greek fathers, the Spirit begins to amplify the archetypical content of the revelation, interpreting it in Gnostic terms. Pythagoras and his school probably had the most to do with the molding of Greek thought, and as one aspect of the Trinity is based on number symbolism, it would be worth our while to examine the Pythagorean system of numbers and see what it has to say about the three basic numbers with which we are all concerned here. Zeller says, 1 is the first from which all the other numbers arise, and in which the opposite qualities of numbers, the odd and the even, must therefore be united. 2 is the first even number, 3 the first that is uneven and perfect, because in it we first find beginning, middle, and end. The views of the Pythagorean influenced Plato, as it is evident from his Timaeus, and as this had an incalculable influence on the philosophical speculations of posterity, we shall have to go rather deeply into the psychology of number speculation. The number 1 claims an exceptional position, which we meet again in the natural philosophy of the Middle Ages. According to this, 1 is not a number at all. The first number is 2. 2 is the first number because with it, separation and multiplication begins, with which alone make counting possible with the appearance of the number 2. Another appears alongside the 1, a happening which is so striking that in many languages the other and the second are expressed by the same word. Also associated with the number 2 is the idea of right and left, and remarkably enough of favorable and unfavorable, good and bad. The other can have a sinister significance, or one feels it at least as something opposite and alien. Therefore, argues a medieval alchemist, God did not praise the second day of creation because on this day, Monday, day of the moon, the binarius alias the devil came into existence. 2 implies a 1 which is different and distinct from the numberless. 1, in other words, as soon as the number 2 appears, a unit is produced out of the original unity, and this unit is none other than the same unity split into 2 and turned into a number, the 1, and the other from an opposition, but there is no opposition between 1 and 2. For these are simple numbers which are distinguished only by the arithmetical value and by nothing else. The 1, however, seeks to hold to its one and alone existence, while the other even strives to be another opposed to the 1. The 1 will not let go of the other because if it did, it would lose its character, and the other pushes itself away from the 1. In order to exist at all, thus there arises a tension of opposites between the 1 and the other. But every tension of opposites culminates in a release out of which comes the third. And the third, the tension in is resolved and the lost unity is restored. Unity, the absolute one, cannot be numbered. It is indefinable and unknowable. Only when it appears as a unit, the number one, is it knowable for the other, and which is required for this act of knowing is lacking in the condition of the one. 3 is an unfolding of the one to a condition where it can be known. Unity becomes recognizable had it not been resolved into the polarity of the one and the other. It would have remained fixed in a condition devoid of every quality. 3, therefore, appears as a suitable synonym for a process of development in time, and thus forms a parallel to the self-revelation of the deity to the absolute one unfolded into 3. The relation of threeness to oneness can be expressed by an equilateral triangle, A equals B equals C. That is by the identity of the 3, threeness being contained in its entirety in each of the 3 angles. This intellectual idea of the equilateral triangle is a conceptual model for the logical image of the Trinity. In addition to the Pythagorean interpretation of numbers, we have to consider as more direct source of Trinitarian ideas in Greek philosophy. The mystery-laden Timaeus of Plato, I shall quote first of all the classical argument in sections 31b, 32a. Hence the god, when he begins to put together the body of the universe, set about making it of fire and earth. But 2 things alone cannot be satisfactorily united without a third, for there must be some bond between them drawing them together. And of all bonds, the best is that which makes the self in terms it connects a unity in the fullest sense, and it is of nature of a continued geometrical proportion. To effect this most perfectly, for whenever of 3 numbers, the middle one between any 2 that are either solids or planes. Page 120, i.e. cubes or squares, is such that as the first is to it, so is it to the last. And conversely, as the last is to the middle, so is the middle to the first. And since the middle becomes first and last, and again the last and first become middle, in that way all will necessarily come to play the same part toward one another, and by so doing, they will all make a unity. In a geometrical progression, the quotient q of a series of terms remains the same, e.g. 2, 1 equals 4, 2, 8, 4 equals 2, or algebraically expressed aq squared. The proportion is therefore as follows: 2 is to 4 as 4 is to 8, or a is to aq as aq is to aq squared. This argument is now followed by a reflection which has far-reaching psychological implications. If a simple pair of opposites, say fire and earth, are bound together by a mean, and if this bond is a geometrical proportion, then one mean can only connect plane figures, since 2 means are required to connect solids. Now, if it had been required that the body of the universe should be a plane surface with no depth, a single mean would have been enough to connect its companions and itself. But in fact, the world was to be solid in form, and solids are always conjoined, not by one mean, but by 2. Accordingly, the 2-dimensional connection is not yet physical reality for a plane without extension in the 3rd dimension. It is only an abstract thought. If it is to become a physical reality, 3 dimensions and therefore 2 means are required. Sir Thomas Heath puts the problem in the following algebraic formula: union in 2 dimensions of earth, p squared, and fire, q squared. So earth squared divided by earth and fire equals earth and fire divided by fire squared. Obviously, the mean is PQ. Physical union of earth and fire represented by P cubed and Q cubed, respectively. P cubed divided by P squared multiplied by Q equals P squared multiplied by Q divided by PQ squared equals PQ squared divided by Q cubed. The two means are P squared Q and PQ squared, corresponding to the physical elements water and air. Accordingly, the God set water and air between fire and earth and made them so far as was possible proportional to one another, so that as fire is to air, so is air to water, and as air is to water, so is water to earth, and thus he bound together the frame of a world visible and tangible for these reasons. And from such constituents, 4 in number, the body of the universe was brought into being, coming into conquered by means of proportion, and from these it acquired a mighty, so that united with itself it became indissoluble by any other power, save him who bound it together. The union of one pair of opposites only produces a two-dimensional triad, P squared plus PQ plus Q squared. This being a plane figure is not really but a thought, hence two pairs of opposites making a quaterno. P cubed plus P squared times Q plus P times Q squared plus Q cubed are needed to represent physical reality. Here we meet at any rate in veiled form. The dilemma of 3 and 4 alluded to in the opening words of the Timaeus Goethe intuitively grasped the significance of this illusion. When he says of the fourth Geber in Faust, he was the right one who thought for them all, and that you might ask in Olympus about the eighth, whom nobody thought of. It is interesting to note that Plato begins by representing the unions of opposites two-dimensionally as an intellectual problem to be solved by thinking. But when it comes to see that its solution does not add up to reality, in the former case we have to do with the self-subsistent triad, and in the latter with the quaternity. This was the dilemma that perplexed the alchemist for more than 1,000 years, and as the axiom of Maria Prophetessa, the Jewess or Copte, it appears in modern dreams, and is also found in psychology as the opposition between the functions of consciousness, 3 of which are fairly well differentiated, while the fourth undifferentiated inferior function is undomesticated, unadapted, uncontrolled, and primitive, because of its contamination with the collective unconscious. It possesses archaic and mystical qualities, and is the complete opposite of the most differentiated function. For instance, the most differentiated is thinking, or the intellect, then the inferior fourth function will be feeling. Hence the opening words of the Timaeus. 1, 2, 3. But where, my dear Timaeus, is the fourth? Fall familiarly upon the ears of the psychologist and alchemist. For him as it goeth, there can be no doubt that Plato is alluding to something of mysterious import. We can now see that it was nothing less than the dilemma as to whether something we think about is a mere thought or a reality, or at least capable of becoming real. And this, for any philosopher who is not just an empty babbler, is a problem of the first order, and no whit less important than the moral problems inseparably connected with it. In this matter, Plato knew from personal experience how difficult is the step from two-dimensional thinking to its realization in three-dimensional fact. Already with his friend Dionysius, the elder tyrant of Syracuse, he had so many disagreements that the philosopher-politician contrived to sell him as a slave, from which fate he was preserved only because he had the good fortune to be ransomed by friends. His attempts to realize his political theories under Dionysius the Younger also ended in failure, and from then on Plato abandoned politics for good. Metaphysics seemed to him to offer more prospects in this unforgivable world. So for him, personally, the main emphasis lay on the two-dimensional world of thought, and this is especially true of the Timaeus, which was written after his political disappointments. It is generally reckoned as belonging to Plato's late works. In these circumstances, the opening words, not being attributable either to the jocosity of the author or to the pure chance, take on rather mournful significance. One of the four is absent because he is unwell. If we regard the introductory scene in symbolic, this means that of the four elements out of which reality is composed, either air or water is missing. If air is missing, then there is no connecting link with the spirit fire, and if water is missing, there is no link with concrete reality. Earth, Plato certainly did not lack spirit. The missing element he has so much desired was concrete realization of ideas. He had to content himself with the harmony of airy thought structures that lacked weight, and with a paper surface that lacked depth. The step from 3 to 4 brought him sharply up against something unexpected and alien. To his thoughts, something heavy, inert, and limited, which no Greek words and no proviatio boni can conjure away or diminish even God's fairest creation, is corrupted by it, and idleness, stupidity, malice, discontent, sickness, old age, and death fill the glorious body of the blessed God. Truly a grievous spectacle, the sick world soul, and unfortunately not at all as Plato's inner eye envisaged it when he wrote. All this, then, was a plan of the everlasting God for the God who was going to be. According to this plan, he made the body of the world smooth and uniform. Everywhere, equidistant from its center, a body whole and complete, with complete bodies for its parts. And in the center he set the soul and caused it to extend throughout the whole body. And he further wrapped the body around with soul on the outside, so he established one world alone, round and revolving in a circle, solidarity, but able to reason of its excellence, to bear itself company, needing no other acquaintance or friend, but sufficient unto itself. On all these accounts, the world which he brought into being was a blessed God. This world created by a God in itself, a God, a son of the self-manifesting Father, further the Demerge furnished it with a soul which is prior to the body. 34b, the world soul was fashioned by the Demerge as follows. He made a mixture of indivisible and the divisible, thus producing a third form of existence. This third form had a nature independent of the same. The different at the first sight, the same seems to coincide with the indivisible, the different with the divisible, the text says. From the indivisible and the ever the same substance, Cornford's sameness, and that which is physically divisible, he mixed an intermediate third, form of existence, which had its own being besides the same and the different, and this form he fashioned accordingly as a mean between the indivisible and the physically divisible. Then, taking these three existents, he mixed them again, forcing the nature of the different, though it resisted the mixture, into union with the same. Thus, with the admixture of being, the three became one. The world soul, representing the governing principle of the whole physical world, therefore possesses a triune nature, and since for Plato, the world is second God, the world soul is a revelation or unfolding of the God image. Plato's account of the actual process of creation is very curious and calls for some elucidation. The first thing that strikes us is the twice repeated he mixed. Why should the mixture be reproduced or repeated, since it consists of three elements in the first place and contains no more than three at the end? And in the second place, same and different appear to correspond with indivisible and divisible appearances. However, are deceptive. During the first mixture, there is nothing to suggest that the divisible and recalcitrant and had to forcibly united with the indivisible in both mixtures. It is rather a question of combining two separate pairs of opposite, which, because they are called upon to make a unity, may be thought of as arranged in quaterno. You have same, different, divisible, indivisible. That's how it's written in the text. Not on anyone's head, it's just like that. Indivisible and divisible together with their mean form a simple triad which has its own being beside the same, and the thought different. This triad corresponds to the condition of thought. Not yet become reality. For this, a second mixture is needed, in which the different, i.e. the other, is incorporated by the force. The other is therefore the fourth element, whose nature it is to be the adversary, and to resist harmony. But the fourth, as the text says, is intimately connected with Plato's desire for being. One thinks not unnaturally of the impatience the philosopher must have felt when reality proved so intractable to his ideas, that reasonableness might under certain circumstances have to be imposed by force, is a notion that must sometimes have crossed his mind. The passage as a whole, however, is far from simple. It can be translated in many ways and interpreted in many more. The critical point for us is, literally, he compounded a form of the nature of sameness and difference in the middle of the indivisible and the divisible. Consequently, the middle term of the second pair of opposites would coincide with the middle term of the first pair. The resultant figure is a quincunx, since the two pairs of opposites have a common mean or third form. Now we have indivisible, divisible, different, same. And then between indivisible and visible, there's beings. Between divisible and the same, there's the third form. Between the same and different, it's natures. And between different and indivisible, it's mean. And this is the diagram that I'm referring to. I have placed the pairs of opposites side by side instead of facing one another as in the previous diagram in order to illustrate their union in a single mean. Three elements are to be distinguished in our diagram. The two pairs of opposites and their common mean, and I understand the text as referring to these three elements when it says, then taking these three existences, since the mean is called the third form, each pair of opposites can presumably be taken as representing the first and second forms indivisible, first form divisible, second form mean, third form, and so on. Their union in a quincunx signifies union of the four elements in a world body. Thomas Taylor, who was strongly influenced by Proclus, says in his commentary to the Timaeus, for those which are connected with her essence in a following order proceed from her, the enema mundi, according to the power of the fourth term, 4, which possesses generative powers, but return to the according to the fifth, 9, which reduces them to 1. Further confirmation of the quaternary nature of the world soul and world body may be found in the passage where the demiurge splits this whole fabric lengthwise into 2 halves and joins them again in the form of an X. According to Porphyry, a X in a circle signified the world soul. For the Egyptians, it is in fact the hieroglyphy for city. Perhaps Plato was trying in this passage to bring forth the mandala structure that later appeared as the capital of Atlantis in his Critias. The 2 mixtures could be regarded as a parallel to the 2 meanings of the physical elements. Cornford, and on the other hand, considers that Plato is referring to 3 intermedia, which he calls intermediate existence. Intermediate sameness, intermediate difference. His main instance is the 3-fold procedure and not in the 4 substance. The Middle Ages were also familiar with the quator elementa A, B, C, D and the tria regimina, 3 procedures which united them as follows: A, B, B, C, C, D. From this point of view, Cornford fails to catch Plato's subtle allusion to the recalient fourth. We do not wish it to be supposed that the thought processes we have deduced from the text Timaeus represent Plato's conscious reflections. However extraordinary his genius may have been, it by no means follows his thoughts were all conscious ones. The problem of the fourth, for instance, which is an absolutely essential ingredient of totality, can hardly have reached his consciousness in complete form. If it had, he would have been repelled by the violence with which the elements were to be forced into a harmonious system. Nor would he have been so illogical as to insist on the threefoldness of his whole soul again. I would not venture to assert that the opening words of the Timaeus are a conscious reference to the underlying problem of the recalient fourth. Everything suggests that the same unconscious spiritus rector was at work, which twice impelled the master to try to write a tetralogy, the 4th part remaining unfinished on both occasions. This factor also ensured that Plato would remain a bachelor to the end of his life, as if affirming the masculinity of the triadic God image. (128). As history draws near to the beginning of our era, the gods become more and more abstract and spiritualized. Even Yahweh had to submit to the transformation in Alexandrian philosophy that arose in the last century BC. We witness not only an alteration of his nature, but an emergence of 2 other divinities in immediate vicinity, the Logos and Sophia. Together with him, they form a triad, and this is a clear prefiguration of the post-Christian Trinity.